Okay, hello class, and welcome to the second module on public opinion and advocacy. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what is advocacy and going through some of Burstein's findings that he presented in chapter 4. So let's get into some slides.
Okay, so we're going to start our slides today with the broad question, what is advocacy? Now, we're thinking about advocacy with respect to how research has looked into it, how past scholars have conceptualized it, and how Burstein is researching it. And it's thinking about all kinds of publicly reported activity supporting or opposing specific policies. Now, publicly reported means it's publicly visible, that it's being described in widely available print media. And opposing or supporting specific policies is thinking not just about how, big protest events for, in support of, for instance, science occur, right? And we know those. But no, it's thinking about specific policy actions, right? Policy proposals, his random sample of policy proposals. Now, it's going to include interest group and social movement activities, and it's going to include protests and demonstrations, but it's also going to include a lot of other aspects that other researchers have not really delved that deeply into. Now, what do past research actually dive into, right? Well, what do we know based on their past research? So we can think about the question, for instance, how much advocacy is out there? And from what we can tell from past research is that protest is actually relatively rare. During the Vietnam War, for instance, the average number of protests a month nationwide was less than 11, and this is McAdam and Sue, 2002. And during the peak also of the civil rights movement, which is one of the most major, eras and movements of protest in American history, protests actually never reached an average of 1 per day. So it's actually less than we think it is. Now, what's the distribution here? Well, Baumgartner and Leach 2001 does a really important study on this, and what they find is that a handful of issues get most of the lobbying. That lobbying actually occurs on a very small group of issues, mainly related to business and industry issues. But that brought more social action issues. Most issues actually get very little attention by advocacy. And then finally, who advocates and how? Well, the research on this is pretty, there's a lot of debates, it's contentious, and it's largely unclear, right? Studies of other advocacy tactics that are not protest and not social movements tend to leave out key actors, and, we don't really know much about these areas, and so it's important to keep on doing research.
Now, with respect to this last question, who advocates and how, I want to just say that I am kind of oversimplifying it here, and we will talk about this more in class, but I want to transition to what Burstein does, because Burstein's approach is really, innovative. And what he's doing is he's looking at, first, a broad news database, and this is different than past research. So what Burstein does is he searches the Procrest news database for stories about advocacy on each of the proposals in his random sample. Now, previous research had just looked at the New York Times. It had just used the New York Times to sample, which was the source of, at least in Burstein's sample, only 10% of the advocacy activities he found using ProQuest. So this is already showing that a broader sample needs to be collected, and Burstein is on his way to doing that. In collecting data, he gathered his data with a very strong, strict predefined criteria, and it had threefold criteria for deciding whether or not advocacy was recorded in the sample. And the first was advocacy was recorded if it referred to the specific bill number or an identical bill in his random sample of policy proposals. It also was included if it referred to federal action on the same general issue of a bill or a proposal in his policy proposals, and in a way that was consistent with the policy proposal itself, right? So if it aligned in that respect. And he also included advocacy if it referred to state level action on the same general issue, and again, in a way that was consistent with the relevant policy proposal. And so he was able to record advocacy activity between 1971 and 2000, and he found 1,614 instances of advocacy. Now, 86% was directed directly at the proposal, 11% was directed at other federal action, and then 3% directed at state level action. And so this is how the sample that he collected was related to those three criteria. Now, what were his findings? What were some descriptive statistics here? Well, what he found about, what these questions, who advocates and how do they advocate, and what kind of advocacy is occurring. Reported advocacy focused on only a few proposals, right? And this is very much in line with what Baumgartner and Leach were finding. He found that 31% of the proposals, the policy proposals, had no advocacy reported on them at all. And three of the policy proposals garnered over 50% of all reported advocacy activity. So see this imbalance here. This is what Baumgartner and Leach have found, and this is replicated very much in his analysis as well. That having been said, this approach likely undercounts advocacy, and this is very critical to note. Many advocacy actions, don't get reporters' attention, right? And even more, many actions even occur in private. So again, it's important to think about the fact that we're looking at what is garnering attention in the public. This is what's reported on. And based on what's reported on in terms of advocacy, there is a deep imbalance, but we can't really know for sure what kinds of actions are happening behind the scenes here, behind what's being reported on, and how those distributions actually play out on that level. All right, well, what kinds of activities, lobbying, sort of advocacy activities, does Burstein observe? Well, most of the collective action take the form of discourse that includes speeches, interviews, letters to the editor, right? The freedom of the press, right? Freedom of speech. That's what's, driving most of these advocacy efforts. In contrast, what isn't driving them, right? What we know for sure is not representing most of the advocacy activity is the right to assemble, right? Protest. We don't see many protest events. We see zero strikes, boycotts, or riots. And so this is once again kind of echoing past research in that protest is actually not that big of a component when it comes to the larger advocacy story, the story of how people try to influence policymaking and specific policy proposals. Protest ends up not being a form of advocacy that is as often, coming up into play, at least based on public reporting. Instead, we see press conferences, editorials, letters to the editor, but then we also see, and the most common one here, 59% is other messages. Now, what is this, right? Well, this other category is something related to newspaper articles who are frequently reporting that somebody is saying something about a specific policy proposal, but where they said this is completely unclear. Right? It could have been in an interview. It could have been at a press conference. It could have been at a large rally. We really don't know. And so in the absence of previous work, there's really no way to know that this was going to happen. So he just codes it as other, but it is important to note nonetheless. They are important to include in his sample because they are utterances, they are public demonstrations of support or opposition to a particular policy proposal, and in that way they are advocacy. Now, very important I think to underline here is that this list does not include emailing or calling your legislator or campaign contributions or grassroots mobilization activity more broadly. And to my mind, this is a big oversight, or at least just something to make sure to note, because these kinds of advocacy efforts are likely the most common forms of individual advocacy, and likely the most common way that public opinion organizes to try to advocate on behalf of particular interests, including specific policy proposals, right? We do see these kind of grassroots campaigns on specific bills saying, call your member of Congress and say, vote against HR XXX, right? We see this often with respect to different organizations. And so it's important to note that this list does not include those efforts, which are largely done without anybody reporting on them. Okay, let's look at Burstein's findings with respect to who tries to influence Congress. So he does find that interest groups and organized advocacy definitely does try to influence Congress, right? And this is 35% of the time. But a big proportion of the advocacy, what he finds is that it's coming from state actors themselves. Now, state actors often do this in order to sort of impress constituents or to, claim publicly support or opposition to particular proposals. But oftentimes they're doing it they're stating things publicly, especially within the press, at no marginal real cost to themselves, to try to garner support amongst their colleagues as well. So these are lobbying efforts done by members of Congress in order to create larger congressional and legislative coalitions as well. So this is occurring often. Now, here are the big takeaways, and this is all from chapter 4, and we're rethinking advocacy, right? So based on his findings, were there surprises here? No, not really, because it's a lot confirming what we've already found about advocacy in general, and that's that it's largely rare, that there's a scarcity of opinions in advocacy, that people don't really have that strong opinions on a whole lot of different issues, and as a function of that, there isn't that much advocacy to be had, at least broadly speaking, and especially with respect to protest, right? Now, does this pose some challenges? Yes, it poses substantial challenges, especially because we don't really know still what are the links between advocacy and policy proposals, right? We do know that it is professionally done often. That's one of the major takeaways here, is that it's not the public organizing. It's kind of underlining what Menker-Olson with the logic of collective action, right? Collective action problems seem to be on point with this because we don't see large groups mobilizing and organizing on their own behalf. In fact, we see professionals doing the lobbying and the advocacy. So advocacy is mainly done by people who are in fact paid to do it on a regular basis. But thinking about all these challenges, thinking about these findings, what the next step is, and what we're going to talk about in class, is that he's going to look into how does this advocacy actually impact policy change, and so that's what's coming next.
Okay, so that'll do it for the slide video lecture. But moving forward, the next step is we're going to do a worksheet that I really encourage you guys to try your best at, because what it's going to be doing is putting towards you now to look through a table, to 2 tables in fact, and to break them down and to interpret them. I've done this for us, going through the videos, and we've talked about this in class, but now I'm going to kind of put it to you and try to see if you guys can build some of your own muscle in interpreting these kinds of findings using these tables, etc. So we're going to be looking at those empirical findings in the worksheet, and then we'll talk more about the effects of advocacy in a broader way in class as well. So cannot wait to see you, and do your best, and see you tomorrow.